Hello, everyone, and welcome to Church Matters, where we talk about how church matters when we talk about world matters. I'm Brian Gross, the priest of Christ Episcopal Church in Cedar Rapids. Along with me today is Chris Hubbs, also from Cedar Rapids and Christ Church.
Hi there.
Have you heard the statement, all boys do these days is spend their time in the parents' basement playing video games? I hear that, often followed by the proclamation that they need to get out and get a job, start being more responsible, go to school, become volunteers, or what have you. In thinking about boys and the state and the role of men these days, a lot of articles have been coming out over the past year. One recently I read from the New York Times by Robert Putnam and Richard Reeves, titled Boy Crisis in 2025, states that since 2010, in talking about young men, suicide rates have risen by a third, that the share of college degrees going to men has fallen to 41%, and 1 in 10 men aged 20 to 24 is effectively doing nothing, neither enrolled in school nor working, which they say is twice the rate since 1990. They go on to say that the male malaise is not just about jobs and diplomas, it's also a crisis of connection as men and boys are increasingly detached from civic, familial, and social life. They are lost in part because they are lonely, and they have become unwoven from the fabric of our society. So with all of the books and the articles and the discussions coming out about this topic, we thought today it'd be an important time to reach out and begin to talk about this, start to unpack a little bit about the roles and the changing roles of men and boys in America. Joining Chris and I today to help us do that is the Reverend Eric Rucker. He's an Episcopal priest and the director of Simpson Youth Academy in Indianola, Iowa.
Hello. Great to be here.
Yeah, welcome, Eric.
Thank you.
So, Eric, tell us a little bit about yourself, if you would.
Absolutely. I live in Des Moines, Iowa, and I work very part-time as an Episcopal priest at St. Andrew's Episcopal Church in Des Moines. My full-time job is part of the campus chaplaincy team at Simpson College that's in Indianola, which is just south of Des Moines. And my main role there is directing this program called the Simpson Youth Academy, where we bring high school students from throughout the state to live and learn on a college campus during the summer, focusing on faith, leadership, service to community, discernment. And as you would guess, about half of those students are young men. And so I bring to this conversation about 9 years of walking alongside teenage and college-age boys as they grow in their journeys and leadership and faith.
And having done that, what do you think are some of the major challenges facing men, boys in America today?
A few things come to mind. I think anecdotally, as I've done listening sessions with boys young men on the ground, one of the most common things I hear is the narrow parameters they've been given around what men are allowed to do and be. And by that, I think the most common thing I hear is related to emotion. So many young men say to me, I don't know what I'm feeling, or I don't know how to cry. I can't cry at all, or I certainly can't cry in front of other people. And often that's linked to them reflecting the men that I look up to. I've never seen them do that. And so that's one of the first things that comes to mind is being given an image of here's what it means to be a quote unquote, a strong man or a competent man. And then saying, well, part of that is you're not allowed to have some of the basic human emotions that everyone experiences.
That sounds like it's a generational thing almost, right? You say they don't, because they haven't necessarily had that as an example, right? Haven't had those role models that modeled that in a good way, that then they're left not only with the culture around them telling them that that's not how man's supposed to be, but that they haven't had any alternate examples to go, well, wait a second, maybe, I've seen this person, or my dad was that way, or this other male role model was that way. And so they're really stuck. I think of the meme that goes around this, right? Like this man would literally, pick whatever horrible thing somebody's done today, right? This man would literally starve half the world and cut off food aid, then go to therapy, right? And there's that kind of that perspective that there are some things that are just a bridge too far, and getting in touch with emotions and with sort of that introspective, like, let's work on myself and who I am and who I can be is just hard.
Right. I had this really stuck out to me. I work with teenage boys, and I started intentionally hosting some conversations where it was only teenage boys together to say, I want to listen and I want to hear about this. And I remember one young man saying in one of those conversations, he was talking about some of the pain of the isolation of COVID and some other things that happened in his life, but then also that pain intersecting with the sort of social restrictions he felt around being able to share that or not being able to share that. And I remember he had said something like, it feels like I have a volcano inside of me that I've had to lock inside of a safe inside of a safe. And I thought, wow, what a potent image for the real feelings we feel in our body, and then the social message he's receiving about having to box that in. And I'm sure we'll get to in this conversation. For me, that's how that's a recipe for danger. That's a recipe for harm to self and others, when that's going to come out sideways. The volcano doesn't just naturally cool in there. It comes out somehow. And so that's one of the things I hear most frequently. But I think something I want to add to that is I think sometimes what I find in maybe more progressive circles, sometimes maybe we stop there at the sort of the individual analysis. And some of what you were mentioning, especially on Richard Reeves' work, the author has helped me understand there's some really important systemic shifts happening that compound the problem. So, a few things that come to mind are, and this is surprising and challenging for my worldview to learn, especially in the last 10, 15 years, young men are falling behind in terms of college attendance. They're behind women now. They have lower high school and college GPAs than women. They have lower graduation rates. And then some of the job loss that's happening because of automation, for example, and shipping jobs overseas, those are hitting hardest male-dominated fields. You think like construction or something like that, versus female-dominated fields like nursing, for example, or elementary school teachers. Those are staying pretty steady. So I say that because for me, it seems like a little bit of this perfect storm where it's like, okay, if we're in a 20-year period where a lot of young men and grown adult men are losing more jobs, are falling behind in education, and are struggling economically, are feeling the pain of poverty, a natural human response to that is grief and anger. But then it's happening to this huge group of people who've been told they're not allowed to feel those things and not been given tools and can't imagine any other model except for I have to be the strong protector and provider. So I think the kind of intersection of the narrow, the very restrictive ways that we've been told we can be men and what that has to look like, mixed with social and economic challenges, together create really a recipe for, I think, grievance and violence. And so for me, that feels connected to why most school shooters are male, right? That feels connected to why there's more political violence happening in our country. That feels connected to the ways that leaves that group vulnerable to narratives like, for me, like the people that stormed the Capitol, and like narratives around male grievance. I guess it leaves an opening for somebody else to provide a narrative that isn't necessarily going to be life-giving or accurate.
When you talk about not having male role models in their lives, and trying to seek out ways to know how to act, what is my role in the world today? I know that as I was growing up, my father had impressed upon us, boys in the family, you're in charge of taking care of the family. Your role is to be the provider, the one that's going to get the job and all of that. Granted, that was started out almost 60 years ago, and I'm not sure how exactly that's changed. But then as I got older, I began to hear the role change from society, that is no longer supposed to be your role, that men need to take up the role of being a partner with women, that it's not necessarily your role to be the provider, which made perfect sense. So trying to hold on to that then come along with, well, then exactly what is my role? And then it began to be a little more, it seemed more wishy-washy for me in my head. What does that look like? So in myself not knowing what exactly my role was supposed to be, then with my children, trying to explain to them what their role is when I didn't really know what my role was specifically anymore. It wasn't as binary as it used to be. This is the man's role. This is the woman's role. Now, rightfully so, we're mixing that and we're trying to put together these new roles, but trying to figure out what does that look like, and how do I pass it on?
Do you want to say anything about what you feel like you learned as you were trying to parent with the society shifting towards less prescriptive and rigid roles for male and female children?
It's still a learning process, really, trying to find out what is right, but impressing upon my children that their individual roles really just based on what role they find for themselves and what they do for jobs, relationships. They develop their own role in that way rather than as I'm a male or I'm a female, this is what my role is, a role as it pertains to their own life and their own situation, their own societal interface, what that looks like. So
I think something related to that I've been pondering is that I'm so grateful for feminist and womanist movements who have educated society about the need for expanded roles in genders, and then especially so much work that has gone into expanding the imaginations of young women that they can imagine being Supreme Court justices now. They can invest in the STEM field, XYZ, and those things all feel necessary and they need to keep being done. I wonder if part of our work, for me as somebody who identifies as a progressive person and a progressive Christian, is to think about what the other side of that equation is for how we talk with young boys. That it does often feel like conversations around masculinity are what you shouldn't do instead of what you should do. It's like, don't be sexist, don't objectify women, don't XYZ, which are all important, right? But it almost feels like a definition by negation instead of a positive and tangible vision of the future. And so, I've thought more about how do we cast positive vision for young people, for young men. So in the same way that it's a feminist thing to say, look at a young woman and say, you could run for Senate or you could be a doctor. I think the other half of that, if we want to create an equitable society where everyone is thriving, is to make sure we tell young men not just you can be a police officer or you can be a doctor, but also you could be an elementary school teacher. You could be a therapist. You could be a dancer. You could be an artist. And so for me, that's another part of feminism, is making sure that young men aren't having to live into that volcano inside of a safe path, but to say, let's remove that safe and let's give you the freedom and a vision of what it means to be a man that might take a couple years off to take care of the kids. And that's part of being a strong man, right?
My background before I became a member of the Episcopal Church was out of very conservative evangelicalism, right? And they have, as by and large, locked into this problem as they've seen it, but then steered it a whole different way, right? That conservative evangelical vein is very men as manly men, traditional, air quotes, traditional gender roles, right? Maybe not even air quotes, maybe that's really just what they're after. Stereotypical warrior Jesus with a sword and tattoos, and pastors that I used to listen to back then talking about how he couldn't worship a sissy Jesus because, he couldn't ever worship somebody that he could beat up, which is got all sorts of resonance to it, right? Yeah. But so those conservative angles have taken a very hey, let's go after men this way, but what do we have to sell them? Well, what we have to sell them is the sort of traditional masculinity that has existed, at least in the American culture, for a couple hundred years, right? So in the more progressive circles, I wonder then, in some ways, I sense the pendulum has swung hard the other way, right? And we've identified the problems of masculinity so much and swung towards how do we favor women that now it's almost unpopular to have the discussion to say, well, what about the men? So I wonder what you think those avenues are of how we can speak positively to that in ways, or how we should as a church.
I agree with your reading of what's happening, at least in my experience and my limited research, that, and again, I'm making broad generalizations, but I think that when I look at conservative evangelical churches, and this is not synonymous, but also Christian nationalism, both of those groups are ahead of a lot of progressive churches in that they are at least saying the starting point is there are a lot of young men hurting and we need to be attentive to that.
Yeah.
And so in that way, I want to say they're paying attention to something that some of my tribe isn't. And so I want to affirm that there's something to learn there. But as you mentioned, I think Christian nationalism both misdiagnoses the causes of that pain and then also has solutions that aren't helpful. Mm-hmm. And so Christian nationalism, in my sense, generally says they point to legitimate grievance, which is poverty, economic pain, etc. But then they say, this is because trans people exist, or this is because of men and women's athletics, or these misdiagnoses. And then they say the solution is to return to a 1950s model of genders and social practice. And so that's the inappropriate, that's an incorrect causal claim, and then an incorrect set of solutions. For me, as I think about being a progressive Christian in the Episcopal Church, I want to be really careful about not being binary, right? In that we need to keep doing the things we're doing to fight for women's rights, right? We need to keep doing the good work we do to ordain women. We need to keep doing what we're doing in lifting up the stories of women in Scripture, right? So we can say yes to all that, and that doesn't mean that saying that men are hurting isn't also allowed, that those things can both be true. And so I think for me, I feel the invitation that the church could be a really powerful site for doing exactly what we're talking about, which is giving the example of and painting a picture of a freer and more expansive version of what it means to be a quote unquote like strong man or a faithful man. I think about you were talking about the sort of anecdote of I couldn't worship a Jesus a sissy Jesus. And so I think for me growing up in the church, it's been a huge gift to give me Jesus as a male, a model for masculinity. Jesus cried 3 times in the Gospels. He cried when his friend died. He cried for himself when he was going to have to do something very difficult. And he cried for his community over Jerusalem when they were off track. And he also stepped in front of a person who was about to be stoned by a crowd. And he also flipped tables in the temple, which I believe is a nonviolent act of resistance. But for me, Jesus is in the embodiment of not being restrained by social and gender expectations. Like he didn't have a safe around his beating, heart. He let it be fully what it was, from weeping to feasting to the other traits which match more with kind of that traditional masculinity, like providing and standing up for people who are in danger. So I think the church as its best has like our leader, the person we claim to follow, is an amazing example of an expansive masculinity for me.
I appreciate you giving some examples about Jesus being a great example for us, a great role model, male role model for us. And I wonder how do we incorporate into the mental health part, the spiritual part, the care of men in the church, just as much as we do for the women, without feeling like we are not following a progressive model, if that makes sense. I know that I had somebody in the past come up to me and say, it'd be great if we could have a men's Bible retreat. Just gather all the men together and do that. And I brought that up to a bishop. This was many years ago, and the bishop said, "You don't want to go there. That would be too exclusive. We really need to make sure that we're including women in all things now." Mm-hmm. So I dropped it. But so then these men who wanted the chance to get together and talk about things in their life and how it related to the Bible as men, as that group, we never did do that. I think the perception is there, and I don't really see it as an actual real reality that we should not be doing things specifically for men. I think that might be something that we have put upon ourselves as men, that we need to be careful. So how do we make this so it's not a zero-sum discussion that if we do something for women, we can't do it for men. If we do something for men, we can't do it for women. How do we equal that out in the church?
I've had a few similar experiences, especially the last 2 years as I've been just kind of listening to my community and saying, hey, here's where some of the energy is. Here's some of what, not exclusively what we want to offer, but here's something we need to offer as spaces for boys to talk. I've gotten a little bit of pushback. And I try to be sympathetic because on the surface, if you just see a poster that says that sounds kind of like some of the things that Christian nationalism does. I understand why people are traumatized by that language. But like you said, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. And so for me, as I've evolved, I think part of what I would say is if boys aren't doing well and men aren't doing well, they're not going to be healthy husbands. They're not going to be healthy boyfriends. They're not going to be healthy partners. They're not going to be healthy coaches. They're not going to be healthy teammates. And so I think it's in a way a more faithful and a more systemic engagement with trying to root out the damages of patriarchy. And so for me, it feels like a deeply feminist commitment to say we have to make sure boys and men are doing well because they are made in the image of God and they deserve healing, but then secondarily because that will also make the lives of queer people and women much better. I read a book called Boy Mom this year by Ruth Whipman, Boimom, about raising 3 young boys and kind of her feminist commitments. And a way that she said it that was really helpful for me was this. She said, admitting that patriarchy also harms men and boys is different from these groups of men who say we are the real victims. Because there is a far-right movement where men try to say we are the real victims. That's kind of incel culture, that's manosphere culture online that tries to misrepresent and say we're the real victims here. That's different from me acknowledging patriarchy is alive and still harming women, but also it operates through me, and that does harm to me too, and that does harm to all the men through whom it operates. And so as Christians, we're called to try to heal everybody. and none of us are free until all of us are free. Only working with women, I think in some ways, isn't going to heal the collective in a way that is what the shalom that God calls us to.
That's helpful to me, right? The idea, I think Brian, you said the phrase that it's not a zero-sum game, right? But that we've got to think about healing as beneficial, both in that, well, as you just said, Eric, right? It's healing of the community, that because we are together as a people, we have those interrelationships. One member hurts, the whole body hurts, right? But that it is beneficial that way. But then that there are also tangible, right? It's not just this sort of spiritual niceness where, okay, everybody's doing good. But the examples you provide, yes, it's great. I need those opportunities for the girls in my family to be able to go achieve these things. I also really want young men and who are going to be healthy partners for them as they're looking for partners. There's tangible useful benefit beyond the sort of spiritual. Well, yes, we know we're all connected and it doesn't need to be a zero-sum game. I hope I end up with some really healthy son-in-laws out of the thing by the time I'm done, right?
Right.
No pressure to my daughters as they listen to this, but
it's very tangible that the fruits of young men having supportive relationships, having narratives that are life-giving. I see the ways that improves the ways that their students, improves the ways that their athletes, improves the ways that they relate to their girlfriends, right? Yeah. Or their boyfriends. You're right. This is very real because the ways that feminism has educated us about the very real abuse and damage and harassment, well somebody's enacting that. Somebody's on the giving end of that harassment and abuse, and that's part of what we're trying to address is what is the woundedness where patriarchy is acting through, right? And that woundedness is acting through men.
I read in an article not too long ago about how in Big Brothers Big Sisters, there are predominantly more big sisters than there are big brothers, so that the young men are not even getting to the point where they're getting out and volunteering in the same way. So then the young boys that are looking for a role model, there are a lot of boys in that program that do not have a big brother because there just aren't big brothers out there. So it really permeates a lot of different aspects in life of men not feeling part of society in all ways. Just trying to figure out how to address all of those different aspects. There's a lot of hurting boys out there, and yeah, there probably are a lot of boys out there that are in the basement playing the video games, as we always hear. That's probably true. I know my daughter dated somebody who tried to get him to do more things, to do things, and she said he just played video games all the time. So I know that does exist. It's just a general thing to say that that's the way it is everywhere. But why is that? Why is that person doing that? Is it because that's just a great entertainment and just really addicted to playing the video games? Or is, I'm not sure what else I'm going to do today, so that's what I'm going to do.
Right.
So offering those opportunities to everybody.
Right. Absolutely. And I think, there are a few things that come to mind. One is that there are billions of dollars and multinational corporations. This is a little bit cliche to say at this time, but men do not wander into these things in a way that's just random. The social media corporations have spent billions of dollars figuring out how do we draw young men into these circles and spheres and continue to engage, not for their good, but for our profit. And so for me, that's that's the stakes of this conversation, is that when progressive folks and progressive churches, I think, simply say, well, we just don't, we don't have time to do men's groups, or we're not committed to doing men's Bible studies because that might be sexist or something like that. That's going to be to everyone's detriment, because when we cede our influence on young men to incel culture and to social media and to kind of fitness cults that lead them to Christian nationalism, somebody's going to pick them up and steer their attention and give them role models, because everybody's going to be searching for role models. And when we say we're not committed to mentoring and discipling this group, which is young men, somebody else is going to do it. And we're seeing the negative outcomes of that.
So if we have people in our churches who hear this, who are excited about it, who want to see more of that, what practical steps would you advise? Right? If they said, "Hey, what's a thing I can do?" What would you suggest to them? What's a way they could take a real step to engage and help boys and young men in that way?
Two things come to mind. One is, and some of this I want to give a shout out to Jonathan Haidt. He wrote a book called The Anxious Generation that has been really popular the last couple of years, doing education around the effects of social media on teenage brains. And so I think one of the things that we need to keep working on is not being naive about what's happening with social media with young people. So both as just adults in the church in general, and then especially parents, grandparents, mentors, we have to develop more literacy about what's going on with young people and their phones. And I think be more proactive about helping educate young people and give them literacy about what corporations are doing to them, the plans that they make to affect their brains and feed them narratives. Because a significant portion of what we're talking about, I think, is related to really social media mentoring and discipling young men instead of the church mentoring and discipling young men. And so I think social media has to be a huge part of this conversation. I don't think it's going to completely go away, but I think when you ask what can we do, I think that's a huge thing, is getting in front of it. And we're learning more and more about how to do that. Jonathan Haidt and other people are putting out even developmental guidelines of here's what neuroscientists suggest in terms of at age 3, a kid can watch TV. At age 8, they can have a dumb phone. At 13, they can have a smartphone. At 18, they should have, so even just kind of getting out in front of it, it's taken us 15 years to understand how social media companies have schemed, to hack young people's brains. But that's one piece is I think we have to get better at that. The other piece that I think goes with it is relationships. And I know maybe that sounds simple. Maybe it sounds really hard. I don't know. But the Springtide Institute put out a massive survey that they did with Gen Z 3 or 4 years ago. And of the group surveyed, 70% of Gen Z students said they have less than 3 meaningful interactions per day. Less than 3 meaningful interactions per day. And I think some of that is because they're on their phones most of the time. And so I think that that's something, again, that's the church's sweet spot. That's our bread and butter, is like one of the few things we can offer that few other places offer is like this real welcome, this in-person relationship and connection. And some of that can be across genders together. Some of that I think could be young men getting together for safe, honest conversation and support.
I think the church has really missed the boat on this for a very long time, as far as being shepherds to young men.
I'm part of the church, so I'm critiquing, an institution of a shepherd. I do want to say, especially when I've done some listening sessions with teenage boys, I was, even though I saw the ways that both culture and the church had some sort of negative or negative influence, or the ways the church sometimes seemed impotent to affect change in young men, I walked away with actually some hope too. There were a number of young men who, I remember one in particular who said, when I got into middle school and early high school, I saw a lot of my friends getting sucked into, again, manosphere, this sort of bro, incel, this content that presents a narrative that says you're the victim here, be suspicious of women, they're out to hurt you, don't even bother. He's like, I saw my friends getting sucked into that. And he said, I really think being part of my local church, being in relationships with men and women, but especially men around there, that kept me out of the worst of that. And I thought, there's still hope here. There's still life in the local church. It's one of the few places where people can show up, have embodied relationships, and especially for young men, see an example of this expansive and healthy masculinity that can grieve, that can weep, that can admit it's wrong and say part of being a man is learning and evolving. And so I also want to name that point of hope that, gosh, I'm completely invested in the church project, even though we fall down a lot. I see it as that healthy churches that are progressive, affirming spaces, as one of the few places where young men can see something alternative to what they're being given online. So I do want to celebrate that.
Eric, thank you for joining us today.
Absolutely.
Enjoyed the conversation. Fantastic stuff.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. And if you know young men or teenagers of any gender that could use some community and mentorship and support, check out the Simpson Youth Academy on the internet, Facebook, Instagram, etc.
All right. Awesome. Great. All right. Thanks for joining us, Eric. Thanks, Chris, for being here. And Chris also for his expertise on the audio and tracks and things, getting that together, all the tech work. Appreciate you all listening to us. Have a great day.